Jack Blackburn was a convicted murderer. He put 2 bullets into a man's chest and left him dead in a dark alley. He belonged in a prison cell for the rest of his life. Instead, wealthy mobsters paid cold cash to pull him out of jail. They did not care that he was a violent killer with a slashed face. They only cared that he knew how to break bones better than anyone alive. They bought a murderer to train Joe Louis and make millions, and that same ex-con took their dirty money and did the impossible. He destroyed the racist color line forever. Jack Blackburn was born in Versailles, Kentucky. Records indicate his birth year as 1881 or 1883. His father was a destitute minister. Blackburn rejected the church early. He saw no value in sermons when facing daily starvation. The family relocated to Terre Haute, Indiana. Blackburn severed ties with his father's expectations. He turned to street fighting for immediate income. He fought in alleys and rail yards to survive. Facing a severe physical deficit at a maximum weight of 140 pounds, Blackburn was routinely pitted against heavily muscled laborers. Knowing that standing still and trading direct punches guaranteed shattered bones, he analytically deconstructed the mechanics of human combat. Stripping away all anger and raw emotion, he treated fighting purely as a mathematical problem of distance and gravity. He observed that heavier men inevitably lost their balance and exposed vital organs when overcommitting to a strike. Blackburn built a fighting style entirely around evasion. He refused to block punches with his arms or head. He trained his reflexes to slip strikes by fractions of an inch. He let the kinetic energy of larger men pull them forward. When they missed, their vital organs were exposed. Blackburn targeted the liver, the floating ribs, and the jawline with precise, snapping counterattacks. He weaponized his small frame and turned his opponent's weight against them. He entered unregulated underground fights. These were brutal, bare-knuckle matches held in back rooms. Men fought until physical collapse. Blackburn used these bouts to perfect his defensive geometry. He hardened his knuckles and controlled his breathing. Though he fought strictly for the winner-take-all betting pools, he soon realized that surviving this meat grinder required professional contracts. Consequently, he packed his belongings and targeted the legitimate boxing circuit, betting his very survival on his mechanical superiority. Blackburn breached the professional boxing circuit in 1901. He walked straight into a monopolized economy. The industry was not a sanctioned athletic competition. It was an unregulated financial syndicate operated by casino bosses, local mobsters, and ruthless regional promoters. These men controlled the physical venues. They controlled the local press coverage. They dictated the payouts. Blackburn brought a superior tactical defense, but tactical brilliance meant absolutely nothing without political and financial leverage. The promoters saw a 135-pound black man with zero financial backing and zero legal representation. They immediately categorized him as cheap, disposable labor. The boxing establishment enforced a rigid, impenetrable racial barrier. The color line was not simply a social prejudice of the era. It was a highly organized, calculated economic cartel designed strictly to protect white financial assets. White champions held the championship belts. Those belts generated massive gate revenues and massive illegal betting pools. Promoters refused to risk their highly profitable white champions against highly skilled black challengers. A black fighter winning a title disrupted the entire financial ecosystem. The white consumer base would not pay to see a black champion, and the syndicates would lose their most reliable revenue streams. Blackburn was permanently locked out of title contention from his first day as a professional. He was explicitly banned from competing for the lightweight and welterweight world championships. White title holders like Stanley Ketchel, Frank Klaus, and Battling Nelson avoided him entirely. They recognized his defensive mechanics were a severe threat to their win-loss records. They refused to sign the contracts. The system protected them. Blackburn was effectively cornered. He needed money for basic survival, rent, and food. The promoters weaponized his poverty. They offered him a brutal ultimatum. He could starve, or he could fight in extreme mismatch bouts designed purely for public spectacle and heavy gambling action. Blackburn chose to fight. He was forced to compete in a segregated shadow circuit. He fought other marginalized black fighters in brutal, high-stakes elimination matches for minimal pay. He was also hired as a sparring partner or a stepping stone for heavier, upcoming white fighters. The system treated him as a human test dummy. He weighed a maximum of 140 pounds. The promoters routinely matched him against men weighing up to 180 pounds. This practice violated every standard of human safety. The massive weight disparity fundamentally altered the physics of the combat. A punch delivered by a middleweight carries exponentially more kinetic energy and concussive force than a punch from a lightweight. Blocking a direct strike from a heavier man would fracture Blackburn's forearms and shatter his guard. He had to rely exclusively on his evasion techniques. He stepped into the ring with Sam Langford. Langford possessed devastating knockout power and outweighed Blackburn by 40 pounds. Blackburn survived the encounters by utilizing constant lateral movement, precise footwork, and sharp counterstrikes. He neutralized Langford's raw, overwhelming power with mathematical distance management. He fought Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He fought Harry Greb. These were larger, violent men known for physically breaking their opponents. Blackburn systematically dismantled their offense. He made them miss. He made them bleed. Word of his defensive genius spread rapidly through the underground syndicates. Joe Gans was recognized universally as the supreme lightweight champion of the era. Gans was considered completely untouchable by his peers. Yet, after clashing with Blackburn in a grueling 1906 bout, even Gans had to acknowledge the grim reality. He admitted privately that Blackburn was a singular fighter who posed a legitimate threat to his physical safety and his career stability. This admission from a reigning legend should have secured Blackburn an immediate, lucrative title shot. Instead, it sealed his fate within the industry. The promoters realized Blackburn was far too dangerous to their established stars. They blacklisted him from any fight that carried a significant, life-changing payout. The financial exploitation was absolute. The boxing syndicates knew Blackburn had nowhere else to turn for income. They forced him into predatory, ironclad contracts. He was paid flat, bottom-tier fees regardless of the arena size, the attendance, or the betting volume generated by his performance. He received 0% of the ticket sales. The men in suits collected thousands of dollars in illicit gambling revenue, while Blackburn bled for pocket change. To make a livable wage, Blackburn had to fight with an insane, inhuman frequency. The promoters scheduled him for professional matches on a weekly basis. In some months, he fought multiple times within a single week. Blackburn claimed to have fought over 380 times during his career. Official athletic commissions captured only a fraction of these unregulated bouts. The physical toll of this schedule was catastrophic. Boxers of this specific era fought with 4-ounce horsehair gloves. These gloves provided zero impact protection for the hands of the puncher. The horsehair would shift away from the knuckles upon impact. The gloves were designed merely to cut the opponent's facial tissue. Hitting a solid human skull with these gloves caused severe structural bone damage. Blackburn's hands began to break down rapidly. His metacarpals fractured repeatedly. Because the promoters allowed zero time for medical recovery, calcium deposits formed over the improperly healed breaks. This turned his knuckles into jagged, arthritic masses. The cartilage in his wrists deteriorated completely. The physical damage extended far beyond his hands. Even with his elite defensive slipping skills, fighting nearly 400 times guaranteed massive cumulative head trauma. He suffered countless unrecorded microconcussions. The repeated kinetic shockwaves traveling through his brain caused early neurological degradation. His vision began to suffer from continuous orbital and facial strikes. His body was breaking down under the relentless industrial pace dictated by the syndicate bosses. They did not care about his medical degradation. When his hands broke, the trainers wrapped them tighter with cheap gauze and pushed him back into the ring. If he suffered a deep laceration, there was no mandatory medical suspension. The promoters would stitch the wound in a dirty back room without anesthesia and put him on a train to another town for a fight 3 days later. They intended to extract every ounce of physical utility from his biological frame before discarding him. The systemic trap began to destroy Blackburn mentally. He possessed a genius-level intellect for tactical combat, yet he was permanently trapped in a cycle of severe poverty. He watched significantly less talented fighters accumulate massive wealth and property simply because they fit the racial and economic requirements of the corrupt syndicate. The physical pain was a constant reality. The financial anxiety was relentless. Blackburn realized the cold truth. He was nothing but a biological battery powering a capitalist machine that actively despised him. To numb the physical agony of his shattered hands and the psychological bitterness of his reality, he turned to heavy, daily consumption of hard liquor. The alcohol fundamentally altered his brain chemistry and eroded his impulse control. The cold, calculating, unemotional tactician inside the ring transformed into a highly volatile, paranoid, and aggressive man outside of it. He began carrying a loaded, .38 caliber revolver at all times. The relentless exploitation of the boxing industry had successfully mutated a disciplined athlete into a highly dangerous, unstable individual. The system pushed him to the absolute psychological edge. The extreme violence he had previously reserved strictly for the canvas was now bleeding out into his personal life. The descent into chronic alcoholism was not a recreational choice. It was a direct biological and psychological reaction to an industrial meat grinder. The boxing syndicates of the early 20th century provided absolutely zero medical infrastructure for the men they exploited. Blackburn suffered from severe untreated chronic pain. His skeletal structure was deteriorating from the sheer volume of unsanctioned bouts. His hands were fractured, calcium-calcified masses of arthritis. The constant, repetitive blunt force trauma to his cranium initiated early-stage neurological degradation. Paranoia began to dictate his daily life. The constant threat of being financially cheated by ruthless promoters or physically destroyed in unregulated backroom brawls kept his nervous system locked in a state of permanent hyperarousal. He consumed heavy volumes of raw, unregulated liquor simply to suppress the physical agony and the relentless psychological stress. The alcohol stripped away his remaining impulse control. He began carrying a loaded firearm on his person constantly. The extreme violence he had previously reserved strictly for the canvas was now bleeding out into the streets. He was a man pushed to the absolute edge by an industry that treated him as disposable industrial waste. His domestic life actively escalated the danger. Blackburn engaged in a relationship and cohabited with a white woman named Maud Pillion. In the social and legal climate of 1908 America, this was a direct violation of strict, unforgiving racial hierarchies. Publicly living with a white woman painted a massive, inescapable target on his back. Law enforcement monitored his movements with hostility. The threat of racial violence or extrajudicial retaliation was a daily, physical reality. White promoters weaponized this relationship to further marginalize him. They leveraged his extreme social vulnerability to force him into even worse contracts, knowing he had no legal recourse and no public sympathy. The relationship also alienated him from his own community. He was completely isolated. The pressure cooker was permanently sealed. The boxing syndicate owned his physical labor, and the surrounding society condemned his very existence. The external pressure inevitably fractured his own bloodline. The tension reached its absolute climax on the night of December 30, 1908. Blackburn was participating in a high-stakes poker game. These underground gambling environments were highly volatile, unregulated spaces filled with desperate men and heavy alcohol consumption. His younger brother, Fred Blackburn, was present at the card table. The siblings were already estranged, polarized by the intense stress of their environment and Blackburn's controversial lifestyle. During the game, Fred launched a series of vicious, derogatory insults directly targeting Maud Pillion. He attacked her character and Blackburn's association with her. The insult crossed a fatal boundary. The argument bypassed verbal escalation and went straight to lethal violence. Fred Blackburn drew a straight razor. In the confined, crowded space of the gambling room, he lunged at his older brother. The blade connected with the left side of Blackburn's face. The physical damage was structurally devastating. The razor sliced deep into the tissue, starting near his left ear, carving straight down through his cheek and terminating at his lower lip. The blade missed his jugular vein by an absolute fraction of a millimeter. Had the razor shifted even slightly deeper into the neck, Blackburn would have bled out on the wooden floor within minutes. It was a lethal strike intended to end his life. Blackburn survived the massive blood loss, but the physical deformity was permanent. The wound healed poorly. Medical care for a marginalized, impoverished fighter involved in an illegal gambling dispute was virtually non-existent. The laceration hardened into a massive, raised, jagged scar that permanently distorted the left side of his face. This physical deformity destroyed any remaining chance he had of securing mainstream athletic endorsement or sympathetic press. To the white-controlled media and the boxing syndicates, the scar confirmed every negative, violent stereotype they wished to project onto him. He no longer looked like a highly disciplined defensive tactician. He visually resembled a hardened, violent criminal. The promoters immediately used his new, menacing appearance to market him strictly as a villain in underground bouts. They used his trauma to drive ticket sales, further cementing his status as a permanent outsider while driving down his actual earning potential. Parallel to his familial destruction, a deep ideological and professional hatred festered between Blackburn and Jack Johnson. Johnson was the premier heavyweight fighter in the world. He commanded massive, unprecedented paydays. He traveled with a massive entourage. He openly flaunted his wealth and his relationships with white women in front of the establishment. While Johnson dominated the headlines and secured extreme wealth, highly skilled lower-weight fighters like Blackburn starved in the undercard circuits. Blackburn despised Johnson. He did not view the heavyweight champion as a pioneer or a hero. He viewed him as a massive systemic liability. Blackburn recognized the cold mechanics of the boxing economy. He understood that Johnson's public arrogance and highly publicized lifestyle gave the white promoters the exact ammunition they needed to justify and strictly enforce the color line. The syndicates used Johnson's behavior to lock out the entire lower weight class of fighters. They refused to give title shots to men like Blackburn, claiming the public would not tolerate another black champion. The system forced men like Blackburn to bleed for pennies in the shadows, taking severe brain damage just to eat, while Johnson collected the major purses and antagonized the men who controlled the contracts. This animosity boiled over into a physical confrontation early in 1908. Johnson walked into a training facility in Philadelphia. He brought his usual loud entourage and demanded a sparring partner, projecting an attitude of complete physical invincibility. Blackburn, sitting at a maximum weight of 140 pounds, stepped into the ring to face a man who outweighed him by over 60 pounds. It was a suicidal weight disparity. But Blackburn did not rely on blunt force. He relied on pure, cold mechanics and geometry. When the heavyweight champion threw his massive looping punches designed to decapitate smaller men, Blackburn executed his defensive system perfectly. He slipped the strikes by millimeters. He let Johnson's momentum pull him off balance. He stepped inside the heavyweight guards and snapped rapid, precise counterpunches directly into Johnson's face. Blackburn bloodied the heavyweight champion's nose and humiliated him in front of his own entourage. Johnson was forced to leave the ring in complete embarrassment. He possessed the physical power to kill Blackburn with a single clean shot, but he simply could not hit him. The incident solidified a permanent, bitter hatred between the two men. Johnson never forgot the public humiliation. Blackburn never forgave Johnson for monopolizing the financial rewards of the sport while abandoning his peers to the meat grinder. Blackburn realized a terrifying truth. Neither the white promoters who controlled the money nor the top-tier athletes who broke through the ceiling cared about his survival. He was entirely alone. The physical deterioration of his body, the facial mutilation inflicted by his own brother, and the systemic financial blockade pushed Blackburn past the point of rational thought. The strategic, highly disciplined fighter was gone. What remained was a volatile, heavily armed man backed into a corner, waiting for a single spark to detonate. Psychological pressure detonated on the cold night of January 12, 1909. The location was a dark, cramped alleyway in the slums of Philadelphia. Blackburn was heavily intoxicated. His paranoia was operating at maximum capacity. An aggressive verbal dispute erupted between his white partner, Maud Pillion, and a black woman named Matilda Polk. The shouting escalated quickly in the confined space. Matilda's husband, Alonzo Polk, stepped into the alleyway. He moved forward to intervene and physically shield his wife. Blackburn did not process this as a de-escalation. His brain, severely compromised by alcohol and years of constant physical threat, registered Alonzo's movement as an immediate lethal attack. Blackburn bypassed all hand-to-hand combat protocols. He reached into his coat and drew his .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Bypassing any protocol for warning shots, Blackburn executed a rapid, uncontrolled discharge of the weapon at point-blank range. The resulting ballistics were catastrophic, as Alonzo Polk absorbed 2 heavy-caliber rounds directly into his center mass. One bullet shattered his neck. The second tore through his abdomen. Alonzo collapsed onto the freezing cobblestones. He bled to death within minutes. The alley descended into absolute chaos. Matilda Polk turned to flee the gunfire. Blackburn fired again. The bullet struck her squarely in the back, dropping her to the ground. The confined space caused erratic bullet trajectories. A stray round ricocheted and struck Maud Pillion. In less than 60 seconds, Blackburn had killed a man, critically wounded another woman, and shot his own partner. Within hours, the Philadelphia Police Department deployed heavily armed officers to the scene. They did not attempt to negotiate. Law enforcement in 1909 handled violent suspects with extreme, immediate, blunt force. Blackburn, completely unhinged and cornered, fought back. He utilized his highly trained reflexes against the officers. The police response was overwhelming. They surrounded him and used wooden nightsticks to systematically beat him. They struck his skull repeatedly until he lost total consciousness. They dragged his limp, bleeding body into a transport wagon. He woke up locked inside a reinforced cell at Moyamensing Prison. He was charged with first-degree murder, the standard penalty for a black man convicted of killing another man in a high-profile shooting involving a white woman was execution by hanging. Blackburn faced the gallows. He possessed absolutely zero financial capital. The boxing promoters, who had extracted thousands of dollars from his physical labor over the past decade, vanished instantly. A fighter facing a murder indictment was a dead asset. The syndicate severed all ties. They erased him from their ledgers. Desperate, Blackburn recognized he needed high-level legal representation to avoid the executioner. He swallowed his intense personal pride and wrote a letter directly to Jack Johnson. The heavyweight champion of the world possessed immense, unprecedented wealth. He drove custom luxury automobiles and carried rolls of $100 bills. Blackburn pleaded for a cash loan to retain a competent defense attorney. He offered to work off the debt in the ring. Johnson received the letter. He publicly and categorically refused. He told his handlers to let Blackburn rot in a cell. The man who had conquered the white boxing establishment left his former peer to die in the hands of the state. The white-owned media syndicates immediately weaponized the shooting. They did not care about the systemic poverty or the untreated brain trauma that led to the event. They needed a monster to drive newspaper circulation. The press aggressively pushed the narrative of a bloodthirsty, uncontrollable savage. On February 1, 1909, the Chicago Tribune executed a calculated media manipulation. They published a massive front-page story claiming Blackburn had committed suicide in his Moyamensing cell. The article explicitly stated he had swallowed a lethal dose of poison smuggled into the prison by a secret lover. It was a complete fabrication. The chief medical officer of the prison issued a formal public denial. He confirmed Blackburn was alive and under strict guard. The newspaper ignored the correction. They refused to print a retraction. The false story generated massive public interest and reinforced the stereotype of a chaotic criminal element within the sport. The facts were irrelevant to the media machine. The fiction was highly profitable. Trapped without funds and facing a biased judicial system, Blackburn knew a jury trial was a guaranteed death sentence. A public defender in 1909 Philadelphia would not cross-examine police officers or challenge the prosecution's timeline. Blackburn engineered a legal compromise to save his own life. He accepted a plea arrangement from the district attorney. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge accepted the plea and handed down a severe sentence. Blackburn was condemned to serve 15 years. His destination was Eastern State Penitentiary. Eastern State Penitentiary was not a standard correctional facility. It was an architectural nightmare designed specifically to break the human psyche. The prison operated on the Pennsylvania system. It mandated absolute, total solitary confinement. Inmates were forced to wear heavy hoods whenever they were moved outside their cells to prevent any visual contact with other human beings. The cells were damp, freezing stone vaults. The silence was absolute and oppressive. The environment was meticulously engineered to induce sensory deprivation and psychological collapse. Many inmates housed in Eastern State rapidly descended into permanent schizophrenia. Blackburn was stripped of his clothing, his name, and his remaining dignity. He was assigned a serial number. He was locked behind a heavy steel door. Blackburn assessed his new reality with the same cold, calculating logic he used inside the boxing ring. He identified the power dynamics of the institution. The guards possessed absolute, uncontested authority. They controlled the food, the labor assignments, and the level of physical violence inflicted on the inmates. Blackburn also recognized a crucial vulnerability. The guards operated in a hyper-masculine, violent environment. They harbored a deep obsession with physical dominance and the sport of boxing. Blackburn realized he possessed a highly valuable currency. He was a master tactician holding elite combat knowledge that the guards desperately wanted. He initiated a calculated transaction. He approached the prison warden. He bypassed the standard inmate protocols and offered a direct exchange of services. He proposed acting as a private, high-level boxing instructor for the warden's sons, and the senior corrections officers. The warden accepted the deal. Blackburn traded his mind to secure his physical survival. He became the chief architect of violence for the men paid to keep him locked in a cage. He analyzed the guards' crude brawling techniques. He taught them how to throw tight, compact hooks without fracturing their metacarpals. He instructed them on leverage and weight distribution. In return, the penal system granted him extreme privileges. He received high-calorie food rations, crucial for maintaining his bone density. He was exempted from the most brutal body-breaking manual labor details in the prison yard. He manipulated the internal machinery of the penitentiary. He transformed himself from a disposable prisoner into an essential, protected asset for the state authorities. He survived the meat grinder by aligning himself directly with the men operating the blades. Blackburn survived the Pennsylvania penal system. He secured an early parole in 1914. He served 4 years and 8 months of a 15-year sentence. His release was not a product of judicial mercy or rehabilitation. It was a direct transaction. He had provided the prison staff with high-level combat instruction, and they expedited his paperwork in return. He walked out of the heavy steel gates of Eastern State Penitentiary as a free man, but he was physically compromised. The harsh dietary restrictions, the damp conditions of solitary confinement, and the lack of proper medical care had severely deteriorated his bone density. He needed capital immediately. He returned to the only industry that would accept a convicted killer with a facial deformity. He re-entered the professional boxing circuit. The landscape had not changed. The promoters were still extracting maximum profit from desperate fighters. The color line was still strictly enforced by the white establishment. Blackburn attempted to rely on his defensive mastery, but his biological machinery was breaking down. Years of bare-knuckle fighting, combined with the physical degradation of prison, left his skeletal structure incredibly brittle. Every time he struck an opponent, his metacarpals splintered. His hands became a mass of permanent, agonizing fractures. He could no longer generate offensive power without destroying his own joints. He fought sporadically against top-tier contenders, absorbing immense physical punishment. The promoters continued to use him as a stepping stone to build up younger, heavier fighters. Blackburn recognized his physical expiration date. By 1923, the pain in his hands became paralyzing. His reflexes slowed. The millimeter-precise evasion that kept him alive for 2 decades was gone. He officially retired from active competition. The syndicate promoters who profited off his blood immediately discarded him. He was a broken asset. They moved on to the next generation of disposable labor. Blackburn relocated to Chicago. The city was a central hub for the underground economy, fueled by the Great Migration. He transitioned into the role of a trainer. He operated in the shadows of the city's grim, unventilated boxing gyms. He possessed the most sophisticated tactical mind in the sport, but his criminal record and his severe alcoholism kept him isolated. He trained local amateurs for minimal pay. He watched the boxing industry continue to generate millions of dollars for white casino bosses and mobsters, while he struggled to pay for basic room and board. In 1934, the power dynamics of his life shifted violently. 2 men approached him inside a Chicago gym. Their names were John Roxborough and Julian Black. They were not standard boxing promoters. They were powerful, highly connected racketeers. Roxborough controlled massive sectors of the illegal numbers game in Detroit. Black operated real estate and illicit gambling syndicates in Chicago. They generated massive, untaxed cash flow. They routinely bribed police precincts and local politicians to protect their operations. They did not answer to the white boxing establishment. They operated their own autonomous financial empire. Roxborough and Black had discovered a 20-year-old amateur fighter from Detroit named Joe Louis Barrow. Louis possessed raw, terrifying physical power, but he lacked technical refinement. The racketeers wanted to build a heavyweight champion. They bypassed the traditional, white-controlled training camps. They wanted a black trainer who understood the absolute brutal reality of the system. They offered Blackburn a contract. The salary was $35 a week. Blackburn flatly rejected the offer. He analyzed the proposal with complete cynicism. He explicitly told Roxborough that the white establishment would never allow a black man to fight for the heavyweight championship again. The fallout from Jack Johnson's reign had permanently sealed the doors. White promoters viewed a black heavyweight champion as a direct threat to their racial hierarchy and their financial monopoly. Blackburn believed taking the job was a complete waste of time. He told them Louis would be forced to fight in the segregated circuits for pennies, just like he had. Roxborough refused to accept the rejection. He explained his strategy. He possessed the liquid capital to bypass the standard promoters. he could buy their way into the legitimate arenas. He needed Blackburn to build a fighter who was technically flawless and completely devoid of human error. Blackburn needed the stable income to feed his severe alcohol dependency. He accepted the $35 a week. He took control of Joe Louis. Blackburn immediately initiated a complete biomechanical teardown of the young fighter. Louis was a natural slugger. He relied on brute strength and wild, looping punches. Blackburn knew that sloppy aggression would get a fighter killed against elite tactical opponents. He stripped away all of Louis's amateur habits. He forced Louis to completely rebuild his stance. He eliminated the wide, unbalanced footing. He taught Louis the strict mechanics of gravity and weight distribution. He drilled Louis to keep his center of mass perfectly balanced over his knees. This allowed Louis to generate maximum kinetic energy from his legs through his torso, transferring the power directly into his fists. Blackburn was ruthless in his methods. He did not act as a supportive mentor. He acted as a military tactician programming a biological weapon. He utilized intense physical conditioning and aggressive psychological pressure. He slapped Louis. He berated him. He demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. He shortened Louis's punches. He taught him how to throw a devastating, compact left hook that traveled only 6 inches, but carried enough force to shatter a jawbone. Blackburn installed a cold, mechanical ruthlessness into the young fighter's brain. He knew the boxing judges were inherently corrupt. He knew white referees would automatically score rounds against a black fighter. Blackburn gave Louis a permanent ironclad directive. Never leave it to the judges. Let your fists be the referee. The reprogramming was highly successful. Louis began destroying opponents with clinical, terrifying efficiency. The syndicate began booking massive fights. The money started flowing. But the immense pressure triggered Blackburn's destructive habits. He was training a global phenomenon, but he was still an untreated alcoholic with severe trauma. In October 1935, his volatility exploded again on the streets of Chicago. Blackburn engaged in a severe altercation with a much younger man named John Bowman. The exact catalyst of the argument was irrelevant. Blackburn reverted to his survival instincts. He drew his .38 caliber revolver in a crowded public space. He opened fire. The chaotic shootout resulted in massive collateral damage. A stray bullet struck a 9-year-old girl named Lucy Cannon, severely wounding her. Another bullet struck Enoch Hauser, a 69-year-old bystander. Hauser died from the gunshot wound. Blackburn was arrested and charged. This was his second fatal shooting. He was a paroled convict with a prior manslaughter conviction. The judicial protocol for a repeat armed offender committing a public homicide was an automatic life sentence. The legal system prepared to process him into a maximum security penitentiary. Then, the true nature of the capitalist machine revealed itself. Joe Louis was no longer just a fighter. He was a multi-million-dollar asset. He was scheduled to fight massive, highly lucrative bouts against international contenders. Roxborough and Black knew that Louis relied entirely on Blackburn's tactical corner management. Without Blackburn, the machine would break down. The racketeers deployed their massive illegal capital. They posted a $10,000 cash bail instantly. They hired top-tier defense attorneys. They activated their network of bribed officials and corrupt precinct captains. The investigation was systematically dismantled from the inside. Witnesses disappeared. Testimonies changed. The narrative was heavily manipulated to paint the dead elderly man and the wounded child as unfortunate casualties of a justified self-defense scenario. The prosecutor's office, heavily influenced by the syndicate's political leverage, dropped the harshest charges. Blackburn was acquitted in a staggering display of legal corruption. He was back in the training camp just 3 months before Louis's next major fight. The system did not care about a dead civilian. The system did not care about a wounded child. The legal authorities allowed a highly dangerous repeat killer to walk completely free. simply because his mind was required to operate a highly profitable sports franchise. Blackburn survived again. He was protected by the exact same corrupt, capitalist machinery that had ruthlessly exploited him decades earlier. Now, he was going to use that machinery to execute his final revenge. Blackburn knew the legal bailout in Chicago was not an act of charity. It was a strict business transaction. The syndicate purchased his freedom to secure their financial future. He owed them a heavyweight champion. To deliver that asset, Blackburn had to manipulate a system far more dangerous than the legal courts. He had to bypass the white-controlled media syndicate. He had lived through the era of Jack Johnson. He watched the press weaponize Johnson's personal life to justify the racial lockout. Blackburn understood that the promoters and the sports writers were waiting for Joe Louis to make a single mistake. They wanted an excuse to label Louis a threat and shut down the operation. Blackburn instituted a draconian set of operational protocols. He stripped away Louis's personal agency outside the ring. The directives were absolute. Louis was never permitted to be photographed in the same frame as a white woman. He was forbidden from entering nightclubs alone. Inside the ring, the psychological conditioning was even stricter. Blackburn ordered Louis to maintain a completely deadpan expression at all times. If Louis knocked a white opponent unconscious, he was strictly forbidden from standing over the body. He was not allowed to raise his arms in celebration until the referee explicitly held his wrist. Blackburn engineered a public persona of complete compliance and mechanical efficiency. He neutered the perceived threat to the white establishment. He forced the media to evaluate Louis strictly on his physical performance, removing all racial ammunition from their printing presses. The strategy was methodical, but it faced immediate sabotage from within the boxing community. Jack Johnson, aging and desperate for relevance, recognized the massive financial machinery being built around Joe Louis. Johnson was consumed by jealousy. He believed he was the only man entitled to hold the status of a black heavyweight champion. Johnson traveled to the Pompton Lakes training camp in New Jersey. He attempted to infiltrate the operation. He demanded a meeting with John Roxborough. He aggressively pitched himself as the superior mentor, insisting that Blackburn was a broken alcoholic who would eventually ruin the young fighter. Roxborough recognized the toxicity immediately. He knew Johnson was a liability who would draw the exact media scrutiny Blackburn was trying to eliminate. Roxborough threw Johnson out of the camp. The rejection pushed Johnson into active, vindictive sabotage. He dedicated himself to destroying Blackburn's work. The opportunity arrived in the summer of 1936. Joe Louis faced the German heavyweight Max Schmeling. Blackburn had warned Louis not to drop his left hand after throwing a jab, noting that Schmeling possessed a lethal straight right counter. Louis ignored the tactical adjustment. Schmeling exploited the flaw exactly as Blackburn predicted, knocking Louis out in the 12th round. It was a devastating setback for the syndicate. While the black community across America mourned the loss, Jack Johnson capitalized on it. He took a massive stack of cash he had won by betting against his own countrymen. He marched down 125th Street in Harlem, waving the bills in the air and openly mocking the grieving crowds. The community nearly rioted and attempted to physically assault him. Johnson did not care. He wanted Blackburn to fail. Blackburn did not panic after the Schmeling disaster. He tightened his grip on the training camp. He enforced brutal, repetitive drilling to fix the biomechanical flaw. He pushed his own failing body to the absolute limit. Decades of severe alcohol abuse were shutting down his liver. His heart was rapidly deteriorating. His shattered hands throbbed with chronic arthritis. He consumed a dangerous volume of liquor daily just to remain standing in the corner during sparring sessions. The syndicate saw his physical decline, but they could not replace his mind. He was the only architect capable of rebuilding the asset. Johnson escalated his betrayal ahead of the ultimate title shot. By 1937, the syndicate had negotiated a massive contract for Joe Louis to fight the reigning white heavyweight champion James J. Braddock. This was the exact scenario the color line was designed to prevent. Johnson desperately wanted to abort the fight. He contacted Braddock's management team. He offered his services as a tactical advisor to the white champion. He explicitly promised to decode Blackburn's fighting system and provide Braddock with the blueprint to destroy Joe Louis. He was willing to uphold the racial barrier just to ensure his own legacy remained untouched. Braddock and his handlers reviewed the offer. They viewed Johnson with complete disgust. They rejected his involvement. The collision course was locked. On June 22, 1937, the fight materialized in Chicago. Blackburn stood in the corner, heavily medicated and physically failing, managing his asset. James J. Braddock was a tough, durable champion, but he was facing a highly calibrated machine. Louis executed Blackburn's geometric fighting system with absolute precision. He did not rush. He did not fight with emotion. He managed the distance perfectly. He systematically dismantled Braddock's defense over 8 rounds. In the final sequence, Louis planted his feet, transferred his weight exactly as he had been drilled, and delivered a devastating right hand. Braddock collapsed instantly. The referee ended the fight. Joe Louis became the heavyweight champion of the world. The color line was legally and functionally obliterated. The syndicate secured their multi-million-dollar monopoly. Blackburn stood in the ring and watched the capitalist machinery surrender to the fighter he built. He did not smile. He knew exactly what this victory cost. He had spent 40 years bleeding for an industry that treated him like industrial waste. He had taken the beatings, absorbed the brain trauma, and survived the prison system. He had manipulated the mobsters, bypassed the racist media, and outsmarted the bitter former champions. He achieved his revenge by forcing the men who locked him out to hand over the keys to his student. The physical toll of that revenge was terminal. Blackburn's internal organs completely surrendered. 5 years after breaking the heavyweight barrier, his heart gave out. He died in Chicago on April 24, 1942. He was 60 years old. Joe Louis attended the funeral, recognizing that Blackburn was the true architect of his entire empire. Louis later named his first daughter Jacqueline to ensure the trainer's name survived. The boxing industry moved forward without pausing. The promoters continued generating massive wealth. The syndicate found new fighters to exploit. Jack Blackburn defeated the system using its own rules, but the machine still extracted his health, his sanity, and ultimately his life before discarding him into the earth. The dirt was barely settled over Jack Blackburn's grave in Chicago before the boxing syndicate moved on. There was no pause in the schedule. There was no halt in the betting lines. The promoters, the mobsters, and the casino bosses simply recalibrated their ledgers. They had lost their chief mechanic, but the machine he built was still generating millions. They extracted Blackburn's strategic genius until his biological frame collapsed, and then they immediately turned their full predatory focus onto his final creation, Joe Louis. Blackburn's cynical, paranoid worldview was entirely validated by the aftermath of his death. He always believed the capitalist establishment viewed fighters strictly as disposable livestock. He was right. Without Blackburn standing in the corner to enforce his draconian boundaries, the system rapidly consumed Louis. The same government and financial syndicate that celebrated the heavyweight champion eventually bled him dry. They forced Louis into massive tax debts. They manipulated his contracts. The man Blackburn engineered to break the color line ended his career physically destroyed, wrestling in low-tier exhibitions just to pay off the Internal Revenue Service. The system took everything from the student, exactly as it had taken everything from the teacher. History attempts to sanitize Jack Blackburn. Sports networks and boxing historians try to frame his narrative as a triumphant redemption story. They package him as the troubled but wise old trainer who found peace in guiding a young champion. That is a fabricated, highly marketable lie. There was no peace. There was no redemption. Blackburn was a man born into extreme deprivation who realized early that violence was his only available currency. He was locked out of championship money by a racist cartel. He was forced into hundreds of brutal, unsanctioned fights that shattered his skeletal structure and accelerated his neurological decay. He was driven to severe alcoholism and paranoia by an industry that offered zero medical or psychological infrastructure. He killed a man. He maimed others. He survived a horrific penitentiary system by trading his combat knowledge to the guards who held his life in their hands. When he finally conquered the boxing establishment, he did it by aligning himself with the very underworld racketeers who operated the same exploitative machinery. He was not a hero. He was the ultimate product of a completely unregulated, ruthless industrial meat grinder. He understood the absolute cold reality of the business. You either operate the machine or you get crushed by the gears. Jack Blackburn fought his way into the operator's seat. He forced the white boxing monopoly to surrender its most prized asset. He exacted his revenge on a system designed to destroy him. But the victory was entirely transactional. The house always wins. The promoters walked away with the millions. The mobsters kept their gambling empires. Jack Blackburn walked away with a permanently scarred face, shattered hands, a ruined liver, and a fatal heart attack at 60 years old. They built the arena, they extracted his blood, and when the vessel was empty, they threw it in the ground.